The father hides a recording device in his daughter's hair. What happens next is terrifying.
Hello everyone. Enjoy these relaxing moments while you watch.
Anthony bent down to tie Lucy's shoelaces. She was only 7 years old, small and fragile. Yet lately, her eyes always seemed to hold an invisible fear. He gave a gentle smile and softly stroked his daughter's hair. Be good at school today, okay, Daddy's princess. Lucy stayed silent, not answering. She lowered her head, her tiny hands clutching the hem of her shirt tightly. Anthony felt a chill run down his spine. Lucy, what's wrong? The little girl shivered slightly, pressing herself close to her father. Daddy, can I stay home today? Anthony frowned. Lucy had never asked to skip school before. Are you feeling sick? Or did something happen at school? Lucy bit her lip and shook her head. No. I just don't want to go. Anthony knelt down so he was at eye level with his daughter, looking straight into her eyes. Lucy, you can tell Daddy anything. She avoided his gaze. A single tear slipped from the corner of her eye. It's nothing, Daddy. I'll go to school. Anthony sighed. He opened the car door and watched Lucy reluctantly climb into the back seat. As they drove, she wasn't her usual chatty self. She just sat quietly, her eyes glued to the window. At the school gate, Anthony pulled the car over and turned to his daughter. Are you sure you don't want to tell me anything? Lucy bit her lip. Daddy, if I'm not a good girl, will you still love me? The question stunned Anthony. He quickly pulled his daughter into his arms. Lucy, you are always the most wonderful little girl in the world. Daddy loves you unconditionally. Lucy buried her head in his chest, her small shoulders trembling. Daddy. I'm scared. Anthony held her tiny shoulders firmly. What are you scared of? But Lucy only shook her head, biting her lip hard. Then she pulled his hands away and ran quickly through the school gate. Anthony sat frozen in the driver's seat, his heart heavy with worry. That afternoon, Anthony arrived to pick her up earlier than usual. When the school bell rang, Lucy walked out of her classroom with a pale face. He waved to her. Princess, come here. Lucy looked at him for a second, then ran over and threw herself into his arms. Anthony could feel her body trembling. What's wrong? Lucy didn't answer. She just buried her face in his chest. Anthony gently stroked her hair, his heart sinking. A voice spoke up behind him. Mr. Anthony. He turned around. It was Mrs. Dawson, Lucy's new teacher. A woman around 50, with her hair neatly tied up and sharp, cold eyes. Hello, I'm Lucy's teacher. Anthony tried to smile. Yes, nice to meet you. Lucy seems like a very sensitive child. Her words made Anthony uncomfortable. What do you mean by that? Mrs. Dawson shrugged. It's just, she doesn't seem to get along with others very well. I think you should teach her to toughen up. Anthony held Lucy's hand tightly. I always teach my daughter to be kind. And if there's a problem, I hope the school can offer support instead of criticism. Mrs. Dawson smirked. Of course, Mr. Anthony. That smile sent a shiver through Anthony. That night, while he was washing the dishes, Anthony suddenly heard Lucy softly crying in her room. He quickly dried his hands and rushed in. Lucy was sitting curled up on her bed, holding her teddy bear tightly, tears streaming down her face. Anthony sat down beside her and pulled her into his arms. Lucy, did you have a bad dream? She nodded. I dreamed, someone took me away. Daddy couldn't find me anymore. Anthony hugged his daughter even tighter. I'll never let anyone hurt you, Lucy. Lucy clutched his shirt tightly. But she said, if I told anyone, they would take you away. Then I'd never see you again. Her words struck Anthony like lightning. Who told you that? Lucy trembled. No one. Anthony could feel his daughter was hiding something. Lucy, you can trust me. I will protect you. Lucy looked at him, her eyes filled with fear. But she still shook her head. Anthony clenched his teeth. Anger flared up inside him, but he couldn't force his daughter. He gently kissed Lucy on the forehead. Go to sleep, sweetheart. Everything will be okay tomorrow. But deep down, Anthony knew, no, everything would not be okay. The next morning, as soon as Lucy left the house, Anthony immediately called Charles, his best friend. Charles, I need your help. What's going on? I feel like something terrible is happening to Lucy at school. But she refuses to tell me. Charles was silent for a moment. Have you tried talking to her teacher? I have, but Mrs. Dawson, there's something off about her. Charles took a deep breath. Maybe you're just overthinking it. Anthony gritted his teeth. No. I know my daughter. I know when she's scared. Charles was quiet for a few seconds. So what are you going to do? Anthony stared hard at the wall in front of him. I need to find out the truth. Anthony couldn't sit still. The feeling of worry and helplessness was suffocating him all day long. He kept checking his phone, hoping for a call from the school, but there was nothing. That afternoon, when he picked Lucy up from school, Anthony immediately noticed that her face was even paler than usual. Sweetheart, how was school today? Lucy was silent. After a moment, she softly replied. Normal. Anthony watched her through the rearview mirror. Lucy was gripping the edge of her skirt tightly, her eyes distant, as if she were in another world. Are you sure? Lucy nodded without looking at him. Anthony knew something wasn't right. That feeling grew even stronger when, the entire evening, Lucy barely said a word. She ate less than usual and kept glancing toward the window, as if afraid of something invisible. Anthony decided not to press his daughter anymore. But inside, he already had a plan. The next morning, while Lucy was still asleep, Anthony quietly entered her room. In his hand was a tiny, specialized recording device designed to capture audio over a long period of time. Anthony carefully attached the device to a small, sky blue hair clip, one of Lucy's favorites. He knew this might be illegal, but he didn't care. If something was hurting his daughter, he had to know the truth. Lucy rubbed her eyes as Anthony helped fix her hair. Daddy, why are you helping me with my hair clip today? Anthony smiled, trying to stay calm. Because I think you're the prettiest when you wear this clip. Lucy blinked, then gave him a small smile. Thank you, Daddy. But as she got ready to leave for school, that smile disappeared again. That entire day, Anthony couldn't do anything except stare at the clock. He had never felt time crawl so slowly. Every passing second made his anxiety grow stronger. Finally, when the clock struck 4 in the afternoon, Anthony drove to the school like the wind. When he saw Lucy walking out the gate, his heart sank. She looked even worse than the day before. Her eyes were swollen and red, her steps heavy, as if she were dragging herself toward him. Anthony opened the car door. Hop in, Daddy's princess. Lucy climbed into the back seat without saying a word. As they drove, Anthony glanced at her through the rearview mirror. Lucy, was anything different today? Lucy shook her head but still didn't look at him. Anthony took a deep breath. Do you remember? I told you that you can tell me anything. Lucy pressed her lips together. After a long moment, she spoke, her voice barely more than a whisper. You can't help me. Those words felt like a punch to Anthony's chest. It took him a few seconds to regain his composure. What do you mean? Lucy shook her head, saying nothing more. Anthony gripped the steering wheel tightly. He needed to know what was going on. And tonight, he would. Lucy fell asleep right after dinner, probably from exhaustion. Anthony waited until her breathing was steady, then gently removed the hair clip and took it back to his study. Anthony plugged the recorder into his computer, his heart pounding wildly. A single audio file over 6 hours long appeared on the screen. He clicked play. At first, there was only the noise of students talking, the scratch of pencils on paper. Then a woman's voice sounded, Mrs. Dawson's voice. "Lucy, stand up." The tone was cold, with none of the gentleness a teacher should have. Anthony heard the faint scrape of a chair, then a tense silence. "It's your turn today." Slap. The sound of a hard slap echoed through the speakers. Anthony clenched his fists, his heart feeling like it was about to burst from his chest. "You're useless. Just like your father. No one will ever love you." Anthony held his breath. "You think just because you cry, I'll let you off? How many times have I told you? Don't look at me with those eyes." Anthony could hear Lucy's choked sobs. "I'm sorry. I'm sorry." Dawson's voice cut in again, bitter and cruel. "Sorry? Someone as useless as you knows how to say sorry?" Anthony felt his blood boil in his veins. Then Dawson's voice dropped lower, slower, but full of menace. "If you dare open your mouth to anyone, I'll tell everyone your father's a criminal. The police will come and take him away, and you'll be sent to an orphanage." Anthony couldn't believe what he was hearing. "Do you want to live all alone for the rest of your life, Lucy?" There was a long silence. Then Lucy's shaky voice spoke. "No." "Good. Now sit down and shut your mouth." The recording ended. Anthony sat frozen, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. A wave of fury crashed over him like a tsunami. What had Mrs. Dawson done to his daughter? No, she hadn't just abused Lucy. She had destroyed her spirit. Anthony shot to his feet. He couldn't let this continue. Tonight, he would confront the school. No matter the consequences. Anthony's breathing quickened, his fists trembling. The words from the recording echoed in his mind like a nightmare. He couldn't wait until morning. Grabbing his car keys, he stormed out of the house. Charles had just stepped out of the grocery store when he saw Anthony. "Anthony. You look like," Anthony grabbed his friend's shoulders. "Do you know what's happening at Lucy's school?" Charles frowned. "What?" "Mrs. Dawson. She's hitting my daughter. She's abusing her. Threatening her." Charles's eyes widened. "What? Are you sure?" Anthony nodded. "I have proof. I heard it with my own ears." Charles was silent for a few seconds, then nodded. "What are you going to do?" Anthony gritted his teeth. "I'm going to end this. Right now." Charles let out a breath. "All right. I'm coming with you." Anthony pounded on Principal Harris's door close to midnight. There was movement inside. A moment later, the door opened, revealing a middle-aged man with an annoyed look on his face. "Do you know what time it is?" Anthony didn't let him finish. "You need to hear this." He pulled out his phone and played the recording. As Dawson's voice played, Harris's expression changed. "This is..." Anthony growled. "Is there anything left to deny?" Principal Harris was silent for a few seconds, then sighed. "Mr. Anthony, I understand you're concerned about your daughter, but..." Anthony glared. "But what?" Harris clenched his fists, then gave a crooked smile. "You think this little recording can do anything to me?" "To Dawson?" Anthony froze. "What did you just say?" Harris crossed his arms. "You have no idea who you're up against." Charles stepped in. "What do you mean by that?" Harris shrugged. "Mrs. Dawson has powerful connections. If you make a big deal out of this, you could lose custody of Lucy." Anthony clenched his fists so tightly that his nails dug into his skin. Are you threatening me? Harris only smiled. I'm giving you some advice. Anthony couldn't hold back any longer. He swung his fist and punched the principal square in the face. Harris stumbled back, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. You've just made a big mistake. Anthony growled. If any of you lay another finger on my daughter, I won't let it go. Harris spat out a mouthful of blood. Go ahead. Try me. Charles grabbed Anthony and pulled him away before things could get any worse. When they got back home, Anthony collapsed onto the couch, his mind spinning. Charles stood in front of him, arms crossed. We can't let this go. Anthony nodded. But they have power. The police won't take my side unless I have enough evidence. Charles thought for a moment, then spoke quietly. What about the press? Anthony froze. Charles continued. I have a friend who's an investigative journalist. Daniel Ramsey. Anthony looked at his friend, a flicker of hope in his eyes. Can you get in touch with him? Charles nodded. Absolutely. Anthony clenched his fists. I won't let them hurt Lucy for one more day. Anthony stayed up the entire night. Rage and worry wrapped around him like a never-ending storm. Lucy's terrified face and her choking sobs from the recording haunted him. At dawn, Lucy walked into the kitchen, her eyes still swollen. Anthony forced a smile, but his heart ached seeing how fragile she looked. Good morning, my little princess. Lucy gave a faint nod without replying. She sat down at the table, quietly spooning cereal into her mouth, without the excitement she usually had. Anthony lowered his voice. Lucy, you know Daddy loves you, right? Lucy blinked, then gave a small nod. I'll never let anyone hurt you. Lucy put her spoon down, her small hand gripping the hem of her shirt tightly. Daddy, please don't do anything, okay? Anthony froze. What are you saying? Lucy bit her lip, her eyes full of worry. If you do something, she'll get angry. She'll. Anthony placed a hand on his daughter's shoulder. Lucy, you don't have to be afraid anymore. Lucy shook her head, tears spilling over. No. She said if I told anyone, they'd take you away. I don't want to be without you. Anthony felt like his heart was being crushed. He pulled his daughter into a tight hug, his voice shaking. No one can ever separate us, my sweet girl. Lucy buried her head in his chest, sobbing. After dropping Lucy off at school, Anthony decided to reach out to other parents. He needed allies. The first person he spoke to was Mrs. Graham, the mother of one of Lucy's classmates. When Anthony told her what had happened, her face turned pale. Mrs. Dawson. I've heard she was strict, but I never imagined. Anthony gritted his teeth. If we speak up together, they won't be able to ignore us. Graham glanced around, her voice lowering to a whisper. You don't understand. The people who've complained about her before, they were all threatened. Some even lost their jobs. Anthony clenched his fists tighter. So you're saying we should let them keep hurting our children? Graham shook her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. I'm a mother too, but I can't take that risk. Anthony took a deep breath. I won't give up. He went on to find Mr. Martin, the father of another boy in Lucy's class. After hearing everything, the man let out a heavy sigh. Anthony, I understand why you're angry. But I can't help you. Why not? Martin avoided his gaze. I was just promoted. If I get involved in this, my job could be at risk. Anthony gave a bitter laugh. And what about your son? What if he's the next victim? Martin clenched his jaw. I'm sorry. Anthony turned away, his heart heavy with disappointment. That evening, as Anthony sat on the couch, his mind blank, Charles came in. I've got good news. Anthony looked up. What is it? Charles handed him a piece of paper. "I got in touch with Daniel Ramsey. He agreed to meet you tomorrow night." Anthony took the paper, his eyes scanning the address. "Thank you." Charles patted him on the shoulder. "Don't let them win." Anthony nodded, his eyes filled with determination. The next morning, Anthony woke up early, preparing for his meeting with Daniel Ramsey, the investigative journalist Charles had contacted. His heart was full of worry, but there was also a faint glimmer of hope. This was his only chance to expose the truth about Mrs. Dawson and what she had done to his daughter. Lucy hadn't woken up yet, but Anthony stood at her doorway, his heart weighed down. Everything seemed calm, but the fear hadn't released its grip on him. Lucy had slowly become accustomed to the silence, but the pain in her eyes had never faded. Just then, Anthony's phone vibrated. It was a message from Daniel Ramsey. It read, "Meet at 3 p.m., the old cafe near the bus station." Anthony stared at the message, then quickly tossed the phone down on the table. There was no time to hesitate anymore. His patience had run out. This could only end with the truth. When Anthony stepped into the small cafe on the corner, he saw a middle-aged man sitting in a shadowed corner. Daniel Ramsey, the famous investigative reporter, looked up as Anthony entered. His appearance was simple, but Daniel's sharp eyes seemed to see straight through everything Anthony had endured. "Mr. Anthony, have a seat," Daniel said with a faint smile, his tone gentle but firm. Anthony sat down across from the reporter, unable to suppress the nervous energy twisting inside him. "I don't have much time. This is about my daughter, and I need your help." Anthony stared directly into Daniel's eyes. Daniel nodded without hesitation. He had heard countless stories from people who had been threatened, from cases large and small that he'd investigated. But the pain in Anthony's voice was something different. "I've looked through the materials you sent. If you truly want to bring this to light, I'll need everything you have. But first, I need you to trust me." Anthony pulled out his phone and played the recording he'd made the night before. Daniel listened silently, and when it ended, he looked back at Anthony. "This is solid evidence," Daniel said, his eyes still fixed on the phone. "But we'll need more if we're going to take on this system." Anthony nodded. He knew this fight wouldn't be easy. But with Daniel's help, he finally felt a sliver of belief that justice could find its way. When Anthony returned home after the meeting, he felt a mixture of hope and anxiety. He knew the battle wouldn't end easily, and Dawson still had the power to deny the truth. As he walked through the door, he found Lucy sitting alone in the living room, her eyes staring at the television without really seeing anything. Anthony walked over and knelt down in front of her, searching her face. "How are you feeling?" Anthony asked, his voice gentle but full of concern. Lucy looked up at him but said nothing. Just for a moment, but it was enough for Anthony to realize she was still terrified, still hiding from something she couldn't or wouldn't speak of. "I love you," Anthony said softly. "If there's anything you don't like, you have to tell me." Lucy just shook her head and lowered her gaze again. A deep sense of helplessness welled up inside Anthony, as if he were watching his little girl slowly lose the innocence she once had. At the same time, at the school, Daniel had already begun conducting quiet investigations. He contacted a few other parents and insiders, gathering evidence and testimonies about Mrs. Dawson and her actions. Still, silence loomed over everything, a dark curtain hanging heavy over the system. And then, just when it seemed everything was sinking into darkness, Daniel received an unexpected call. It was from an anonymous parent, someone whose identity Daniel didn't yet know, but their testimony changed everything. This person had information about Mrs. Dawson's misconduct and revealed that many people were afraid of her. However, the caller also agreed to provide crucial evidence, on the condition that the investigation would be brought into the public eye. Daniel quickly gathered additional information and sent it to Anthony. These testimonies would be crucial evidence, helping them reach a final conclusion. It was Anthony's last hope. That entire night, Anthony couldn't sleep. He played the recording over and over again, wondering if there was anything he had missed. But every time he listened, his anger flared up again. The threats, the slaps, the cruel words. They played in his mind like ghosts he couldn't chase away. Lucy had endured far too much, and Anthony couldn't let it continue. Things had already gone too far. He had to fight. The next day, Daniel called Anthony. He informed him that the first report was ready and that the information would be released soon. A press interview would be held later that week. "Justice will be served, Mr. Anthony. I won't let them crush us," Daniel said over the phone. Anthony exhaled deeply, but he still couldn't feel at ease. This was only the first step, and he knew the fight ahead wouldn't be easy. But he was ready. The following day, Anthony woke up with a growing sense of tension. What was about to happen would change his life and Lucy's forever. He knew this battle wasn't just happening in the shadows of a single school, but against an entire system of power that Mrs. Dawson and those around her had built. But Anthony had no way back. He hadn't slept all night. Thoughts of Dawson's threats and the school's helpless defense of her swirled through his mind. But now, he had a glimmer of hope. Daniel Ramsey and the people standing behind him were their only chance to reclaim justice. That morning, after Lucy had left for school, Anthony received a phone call from Daniel. The reporter's voice came through, firm and decisive. "Mr. Anthony, today we're going public. The article is ready. We have to move fast before they have a chance to react," Daniel said with determination. Anthony stayed quiet for a moment. He knew this was the biggest step, the one they couldn't take back. But he didn't hesitate. For his daughter, for everything that had happened, he had to do this. "Thank you, Daniel. I trust you," Anthony replied, his voice low but resolute. "No need to thank me. This is what we have to do. We'll meet this afternoon at the press office. Stay quiet until everything is done." Anthony nodded, even though Daniel couldn't see him. He ended the call, his heart tight with tension but full of determination. That afternoon, as the dim light of sunset filtered through the windows of the press office, Anthony walked in. Daniel was already waiting. The two men sat down, and the article was laid out in front of Anthony. "This is everything I've gathered. I'm sending it to print right now and uploading it online," Daniel said, handing Anthony a printed copy before continuing. "Justice will be revealed." Anthony looked over the article, which contained every detail about Mrs. Dawson. Her violent behavior, the threats she made toward students, and the complicity of certain people within the school were all clearly stated. Everything from the recordings to the testimonies of parents and witnesses had been compiled into one complete, thorough report. "I'll make sure people know the truth," Anthony whispered, his eyes gleaming with determination. When the article was published, Anthony couldn't tear his eyes away from the screen. Comments and shares spread rapidly across social media. Other parents started speaking out. They couldn't stay silent after learning the truth about what had been happening at the school their children attended. Daniel called Anthony right after the article went live. "We did it. The article is causing a stir. The police can't ignore this anymore," Daniel said, his voice filled with pride. "Good. But what do we do next?" Anthony asked, his tone serious. "The police will have to step in. But here's the important part, we need to keep the pressure on. If we don't, they might try to cover everything up again." A wave of worry rose in Anthony's chest. He knew the fight wasn't over. This was only the beginning. The next day, when Anthony went to pick Lucy up from school, something unexpected happened. As soon as he stepped through the school gate, he noticed a group of parents standing near the courtyard, talking among themselves. They all looked at Anthony with eyes full of admiration and sympathy. One of them, Mrs. Lawson, stepped toward him. "Mr. Anthony, we've read the article. We're not going to let this slide. Our children deserve to be protected." Anthony felt a powerful wave of emotion rising inside him. These parents were no longer afraid. They had decided to stand up against the injustice. Anthony smiled and thanked them. It was a clear sign that justice would not be silenced by power. "Thank you," Anthony said, his voice full of emotion. "Your support means everything to me and to Lucy." As Anthony got into the car and began driving home, a mix of emotions flooded his heart. He knew they had achieved an initial victory, but the challenges ahead were still immense. Mrs. Dawson and the system wouldn't give up easily. They would do anything to protect their power. But Anthony was determined. He couldn't turn back now, couldn't give up while his daughter was still under threat. When he arrived home, he found Lucy sitting in the living room. Her eyes still held traces of worry, but at least today, she wasn't as afraid as she had been in the days before. Anthony walked into the room and pulled his daughter into his arms. "I love you so much, sweetheart," Anthony whispered. Lucy looked up at him, her eyes brightening. "Daddy, I believe you can do it." Anthony lifted his head, his heart surging with emotion. This fight wasn't just his alone. It was for people like Lucy, people who reminded him that it was never too late to stand up and protect the ones you love. The next day, the faint morning light filtered through the living room window as Anthony sat at the kitchen table, his eyes fixed on his phone screen. Notifications about Daniel's article were pouring in. Posts, comments of support, and calls for justice were spreading everywhere. Anthony felt a faint glimmer of hope in his heart, but he knew this fight had only just begun. Lucy was still asleep, but Anthony could feel the anxiety lingering in the air. He wouldn't be able to rest until everything was resolved. Last night, he'd heard rumors circulating in the parent community. Many had decided to speak up and refuse to endure the fear any longer. The parents Anthony had met were now staying in contact with one another, and a wave of resistance was slowly taking shape. However, what worried him most was how Mrs. Dawson and her allies within the school would react. Not long after, an unexpected call came through. It was from Daniel. "Mr. Anthony, the situation is more tense than we thought," Daniel's determined voice came over the line. "Some people have already started pushing back against the article. The police and authorities are beginning to get involved, but there are still many people at the school trying to silence everyone." Anthony clenched his fists, the familiar feeling of unease washing over him once more. He couldn't let things fall into silence again. "We have to keep up the pressure. Justice won't come on its own, Daniel," Anthony said, his voice firm. "I know, Mr. Anthony. Be patient just a little longer. Things are beginning to shift. But we can't stop now. I'll help you, we'll make sure everyone knows the truth." Daniel ended the call, leaving Anthony with a mixture of hope and anxiety. The battle had begun, but Anthony knew all too well this wasn't going to be easy. The people protecting Dawson weren't the kind to surrender without a fight. Around 2 in the afternoon, Anthony received a message from Mrs. Lawson. She was one of the first parents to openly support him and his family. The message read, "Mr. Anthony, I've spoken with several others at the school. They've all agreed to stand up and testify against Mrs. Dawson. We can't let this continue any longer." Anthony felt a small wave of relief. These parents were no longer afraid. They understood clearly now that if they didn't act, their children would continue to suffer the same horrors Lucy had endured. As soon as the article was widely circulated, the school's reaction was swift. An emergency meeting was held on campus, with the principal and several key teachers in attendance. Anthony knew that if he didn't seize this opportunity, they would find a way to cover things up once again. That afternoon, Anthony and Daniel arrived at the school, prepared to confront the school's leadership. As they stepped into the conference room, a tense atmosphere filled the space. The teachers and Principal Harris sat in silence, exchanging anxious glances. Anthony had no patience left. He walked in and stared directly into the principal's eyes. "What do you think about today's article?" Anthony asked, his voice barely masking his fury. Principal Harris tried to stay composed, but there was clear unease in his expression. "Mr. Anthony, I'm not sure this was the proper way to handle the situation. What happens within this school should be managed discreetly and fairly." "Fairly?" Anthony scoffed, a bitter smile tugging at his lips. "Is that what you call it? Fair? Mrs. Dawson abused the students. And you, along with others in this school, covered for her. You chose to stand on the side of the wrong, and I'm not going to let that continue." Daniel stood behind Anthony, watching the scene unfold. His eyes gleamed. This was the first real victory for the truth. "We have enough evidence. The police will be here tomorrow to begin their investigation," Daniel said coldly to the principal. Harris clenched his fists, clearly struggling to contain his anger. But he had no defense left. The recording, the testimonies, and the published article had exposed everything. The cover-up by Harris and his colleagues was finally coming to an end. It was time for them to pay the price. That evening, Anthony sat in the living room with Lucy. She looked at him, her eyes still holding traces of fear but also a glimmer of hope. "Daddy, can I go back to school?" Lucy asked timidly. Anthony took her hand gently, comforting her. "You'll go back when you feel safe, sweetheart. And I'll always be here to protect you." Lucy gave him a small smile, though there was still worry in her eyes. But at least tonight, she could sleep peacefully, no longer afraid that someone would hurt her. The next day, something unexpected happened. Newspapers and television networks began covering the story extensively. Stories about Mrs. Dawson's victims made headlines. Interviews with parents and other students all revealed the abuse that had taken place at the school. The pressure from the public and the media left the school with no choice but to act. Police began their investigation, and the first steps toward justice were underway. Mrs. Dawson was suspended from her position, and Principal Harris was forced to face the consequences of his role in protecting her. Anthony finally saw a glimmer of hope, not just for himself, but for Lucy as well. This fight was no longer just about exposing the truth, it was a battle against fear, against those who had abused their power to harm children. And even though the road ahead was still full of challenges, Anthony knew he would never give up. For his daughter. For justice. He would fight until the very end. The next morning, the light of day couldn't erase the tension in Anthony's heart. Even though the article had been published and many people had begun to stand up for the truth, he knew the job wasn't done. Justice could only be fully realized when those in power were brought into the light and held accountable for the terrible things they had done. When Anthony woke up, his phone was flooded with messages and missed calls. He read through a few of them from other parents at the school. They thanked him for bringing the truth to light. Some even promised to stand with him as they fought against the injustice that had plagued their school. However, what worried Anthony most was that Mrs. Dawson and Principal Harris were still being protected by the system, even though the veil had been lifted. He knew it wouldn't be easy to bring them fully into the light. But now that everything had been made public, they wouldn't be able to escape responsibility so easily. In the morning, after dropping Lucy off at school, Anthony went to meet Daniel Ramsey. He had been working tirelessly to ensure the article was widely distributed and to stir up a massive wave of public response. Daniel had already reached out to several other media outlets and was planning to organize an interview with witnesses, including parents who had personally seen Mrs. Dawson's abusive behavior. Daniel opened the door and greeted Anthony. "Good morning. I've got everything ready," Daniel said with a smile, though his expression remained serious. "We can put even more pressure on them now. The article has shaken things up, but don't think for a second they'll admit to their crimes easily." Anthony nodded, his gaze resolute. "I understand. But we're not stopping. They have to pay for what they've done." Daniel let out a sigh. "We need an even stronger move. The police have started their investigation, but without more evidence, they'll drag the process out. He paused before continuing. You need to rally more support from the community, from the other parents. The more people who stand up, the harder it will be for them to hide the truth. Anthony clenched his fists tightly. I'll do whatever it takes. They won't get away with this. Less than an hour later, the next article was published, and it quickly became a hot topic across all media platforms. The audio recordings Anthony and Daniel had collected from other parents and students were broadcast live. Testimonies from witnesses made the public realize that Mrs. Dawson's actions weren't an isolated incident but part of a systematic pattern of abuse. The article made it clear that Mrs. Dawson's emotional and physical abuse had been going on for a long time, seriously affecting not only Lucy but many other students. Her threats, along with Principal Harris's deliberate concealment of the truth, had left the victims too afraid to speak out. They had feared for their futures, terrified of being expelled or ostracized from school. Anthony witnessed a powerful storm of reactions from the community. Parents, students, and supporters all began speaking up together. The pressure grew heavier by the hour. Cries for justice echoed everywhere. The authorities were finally forced to step in, and an official investigation was launched. The situation grew more intense, and Anthony knew this was the critical moment to hold on to his determination. As the police investigation began, undeniable evidence against Mrs. Dawson and Principal Harris surfaced one after another. The authorities gathered more critical proof from earlier investigations, including videos secretly recorded by students in the classroom, capturing Mrs. Dawson threatening and physically assaulting them. Anthony received a call from Charles, his closest friend. Charles informed him that the authorities had officially summoned Mrs. Dawson and Principal Harris for questioning. They would have to face serious charges. Anthony, I just heard from people inside the school. They've begun a formal investigation into Dawson and Harris. There's a chance they could face severe penalties, Charles said, pride resonating in his voice. Anthony took a deep breath, still struggling to believe that the people who had stolen his daughter's childhood were finally being brought to justice. We won't stop until they pay for everything, Anthony replied firmly. The official investigation soon extended beyond the school grounds. Everyone was talking about the case. Stories of Mrs. Dawson's abuse of power and Principal Harris's cover-ups sparked outrage throughout the community. Past incidents also began to resurface, and more victims came forward. Some parents didn't hesitate to demand the chance to speak out about what they knew. Meanwhile, Mrs. Dawson found herself under overwhelming pressure from every direction. She desperately tried to justify and excuse her actions, but the evidence against her was overwhelming. No one believed her explanations anymore. The police proceeded with her arrest and conducted a deeper investigation into her misconduct over the years. That day, when Mrs. Dawson was arrested, the entire school was in shock. Students and parents alike couldn't believe their eyes as they watched her being led away in handcuffs. The rumors had been confirmed, and there was a sense, like waking from a nightmare, that it was finally over. But for Anthony, this was only the first step. The truth didn't just need to be acknowledged, it demanded consequences. Anthony stood outside the school, watching as the police gathered evidence and took statements from the victims. He felt a slow, growing sense of relief filling his heart. But he knew this battle wasn't over yet. He still had to make sure that Principal Harris wouldn't escape responsibility. The police continued their investigation, but this time, it wasn't only the witnesses who spoke up, the students themselves had found the courage to tell their stories. An emergency meeting was held at the school, where Principal Harris and Mrs. Dawson had to face serious accusations. The tension in the air was palpable as parents, students, and even teachers stood together on the side of justice. Everyone knew the truth had finally come to light, but now was the time for those responsible to pay the price. That morning, Anthony returned to the school, his heart heavy with unease. Even though Mrs. Dawson had been arrested and Principal Harris was under scrutiny, he still felt the need to confront everything directly. He needed to be certain his daughter would never have to live through these nightmares again. When he stepped into the office, he found Daniel Ramsey already waiting. The reporter had become Anthony's most trusted ally throughout this entire fight. Daniel looked up and offered him an encouraging smile. "We're almost there, Anthony. Today will be a turning point," Daniel said, his voice carrying a sense of confidence. Anthony met his gaze, unwavering. "I won't stop until they face full accountability," Anthony replied, his tone resolute. The meeting began, and the atmosphere in the school was suffocating. All eyes were fixed on Mrs. Dawson and Principal Harris. Both of them were led into the meeting room, their faces gaunt, their eyes filled with fear. This didn't surprise Anthony. After everything that had happened, justice had finally arrived. Mrs. Dawson was no longer a teacher at the school, and Principal Harris had been suspended from his position. But what mattered most to Anthony was seeing his daughter in her classroom, no longer afraid, no longer glancing over her shoulder whenever Dawson passed by. The threats, the abuse, the fear now, they were just part of the past. "I stayed silent for too long," a voice spoke from among the parents. It was Mrs. Lawson, who had stood beside Anthony from the beginning. "But now, nothing can stop us. Justice must be served." Principal Harris tried to defend himself, but the evidence was undeniable. The recordings, the videos, and the testimonies from other students were enough to bring both of them to justice. "You can't do this, Anthony," Harris barked. "You're destroying everything I built here." Anthony stared at him coldly. "What did you build?" he replied, his voice sharp. "A system that covered up crimes? A school that wasn't safe for its students?" Everyone in the room looked at each other, and then, slowly, all eyes turned to Anthony. There was no one left to defend those who had protected such evil. Mrs. Dawson was no longer a teacher, and Principal Harris would now be formally investigated and held accountable for his actions. The police began making arrests and conducting investigations into the actions of Mrs. Dawson and Principal Harris. More evidence continued to surface, and neither of them could escape punishment. Mrs. Dawson was placed in temporary detention, and the investigation into her years of abuse was expanded. A criminal case was opened, and she would have to answer before the law for everything she had done. Principal Harris was not spared from responsibility either. Despite his authority within the school, he could not avoid the truth. Every action he had taken to cover up the abuse, every threat, and his prolonged silence now forced him to face serious consequences. When it was all over, and the official investigation was made public, Anthony felt a wave of relief rise within him. At last, he could see his daughter happy again. After all the days and nights of worry and pain, he had finally brought justice to Lucy. On a quiet evening, after everything had settled down, Anthony sat beside Lucy. She was no longer afraid, no longer anxious. Lucy looked up at her father, her eyes clear once more. "Daddy, I knew you would save me," Lucy said softly, her voice full of trust. Anthony smiled, his eyes shining with emotion. "I will always protect you, sweetheart. Always." Their life could move forward now. Lucy would no longer have to live in fear, and Anthony would always stand by his daughter's side, protecting her for as long as he could. Those who had done wrong had paid the price for their actions. And justice had been served. The lesson from this story is that truth and justice will always have the power to overcome fear and oppression. Even when facing power, silence, or cover-ups, we must have the courage to speak out in defense of what is right. Taking the right action, no matter how difficult, will bring about change. Moreover, the love and protection of family is a powerful force that helps us overcome challenges, bringing justice and safety to the ones we love.
If you enjoyed this story, we invite you to give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Your support motivates us to keep bringing heartwarming stories almost every day. We are very grateful for your support. See you soon.